This wasn't a crime hidden from the church. It was a crime protected by it. Everyone trusted him. That trust is exactly how the crimes lasted so long. Everyone trusted him. That trust is exactly how the crimes lasted so long. In the city of Lyon, Catholic tradition was woven deeply into daily life. Families attended the same parishes for generations. Children joined church scouting groups not just for faith, but for structure, friendship, and moral grounding. Priests were mentors, leaders, and trusted guardians. Father Bernard Preynat was one of those men. For years, he was known as a dedicated parish priest and a leader of Catholic scouting groups in the Lyon region. Parents trusted him implicitly. They allowed their sons to attend camps, retreats, and private meetings under his supervision. There was no reason to doubt him. The abuse began in the 1970s. Preynat targeted young boys, often during scouting activities. The assaults happened during camps, overnight trips, and moments when children were isolated from peers. Victims later described confusion rather than immediate fear. Preynat framed the abuse as affection, sometimes as spiritual guidance. He relied on authority and silence rather than threats. What made this case especially disturbing was not only the abuse but how openly it was known. Parents complained. As early as the late 1980s and 1990s, families reported Preynat's behavior to church officials. Some confronted him directly. Others spoke to bishops and diocesan leaders. The allegations were not vague. They were specific, repeated, and credible. The church did not go to police. Instead, Preynat admitted to misconduct internally. He acknowledged inappropriate behavior with minors. Church authorities accepted his admissions and chose secrecy. He was not removed from ministry. Preynat was reassigned to different parishes and roles. At times, he was quietly discouraged from working with scouting groups, but never fully prohibited. No public warning was issued. Parents in new parishes were never informed of his history. The abuse continued. For decades, Preynat remained active within the church. Victims grew into adults, carrying trauma they struggled to name. Many believed what happened was somehow their fault. Others assumed that because church leadership knew and did nothing, speaking publicly would be pointless. Silence became institutional. If you follow real stories where faith and power collide, this channel is for you. The setting changed in the early 2010s, when one survivor decided silence was no longer an option. His name was Alexander Hezes as a child. He had been abused by Preynat in the 1980s. As an adult, he approached church officials again, not just to report abuse, but to demand accountability. What he encountered was familiar. Church leaders acknowledged the abuse. They expressed regret, but they discouraged him from involving police, suggesting the statute of limitations might apply, and that pursuing legal action would only reopen wounds. Hezes refused to accept that answer. In 2015, he went public. His decision triggered a chain reaction. More survivors came forward. They formed a victims group called La Parole Libérée, freed speech. Their testimonies revealed a pattern spanning decades, involving dozens of victims and repeated institutional inaction. The public response in France was explosive. Media investigations uncovered evidence that multiple bishops were aware of Preynat's abuse long before authorities were notified. Most notably, Cardinal Philippe Barbarin, the Archbishop of Lyon, had been informed of the allegations years earlier and allowed Preynat to remain in ministry. The question shifted. It was no longer only about Preynat, it was about who protected him. In 2016, French prosecutors opened a criminal investigation. Bernard Preynat was arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual abuse of minors. Church offices were searched. Documents were seized. The wall of silence began to crack. During the investigation, Preynat admitted to abusing boys over many years. He described his actions as compulsive. His confessions aligned with survivor testimonies. In 2020, Preynat was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. For survivors, the conviction was historic, not because of the sentence length, but because it represented acknowledgement after decades of denial. But the legal consequences did not stop with him. Cardinal Barbarin was charged with failing to report child abuse. Although his conviction was later overturned on appeal, the damage to the Church's credibility was severe. The case forced France to confront how deeply institutional loyalty had overridden legal and moral responsibility. The aftermath reshaped the country. French Catholic attendance declined sharply. National debates erupted about mandatory reporting laws and church accountability. Survivors were invited into public forums, schools, and government hearings to speak openly about what had been hidden. For many victims, speaking did not erase the past, but it reclaimed power. They described lives marked by anxiety, broken trust, and fractured faith. Some left religion entirely. Others separated belief from institution, refusing to let silence define their experience any longer. The reflection is painfully clear. Bernard Preynat did not operate in secrecy. He confessed. He was reported. He was known. What protected him was not ignorance. It was deliberate restraint. A system that treated abuse as a problem to be managed quietly, rather than a crime to be confronted publicly. For decades, the Church chose to protect itself from scandal instead of protecting children from harm. And when crimes are buried long enough, they do not disappear. They wait. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. John Eckhardt, a Chicago-based preacher known internationally for his fiery sermons on deliverance, spiritual warfare, and breaking generational curses, is one of the most troubling examples of how religious authority can mutate into unchecked psychological and financial control. Curiosity surrounds many preachers who rise to fame, but with Eckhardt, the curiosity was almost magnetic. In the early 1990s, people in Chicago's South Side began talking about a young preacher whose sermons were unlike anything they had heard before. He spoke with military precision, describing the spirit world as a battlefield and himself as one of its frontline commanders. His early conferences were packed with individuals desperate for healing, freedom, or purpose. He became known for identifying demons by name, listing spiritual hierarchies, and declaring that he had a divine blueprint for defeating evil. His church, Crusaders Ministries, began as a modest congregation, a few dozen people meeting in a rented facility. But within a decade, he had built a global following. His deliverance manuals, prayer guides, and warfare textbooks became international bestsellers. To many, he was a hero, a man who validated their inner struggles, who told them their pain wasn't a personal failure but a spiritual attack that could be defeated. Early members described him as strict but caring. He demanded discipline. He preached holiness. He insisted that spiritual growth required sacrifice. For many who joined the church, these demands felt reassuring, a sign of structure and purpose in an otherwise chaotic world. But as time passed, the line between discipline and domination began to blur. Those who stayed long enough began noticing the early signs of trouble. Every church has leadership. This was different. Eckhardt positioned himself not as a pastor but as a prophetic general. His word was final, not to be challenged, not to be questioned. If someone disagreed with him, he accused them of rebellion. If they asked for transparency in church finances, he accused them of being controlled by the spirit of division. If someone wished to leave the ministry, he suggested they were being influenced by demons trying to destroy their destiny. The church culture shifted from empowerment to fear. Members who hesitated to obey pastoral orders were pressured to attend deliverance sessions, during which they were told to confess anything that could be considered a foothold for demonic activity. These confessions were sometimes recorded, sometimes documented, and often used as leverage to keep people compliant. Money became the next pressure point. Paranoia about curses, generational bondage, and spiritual sabotage created a fertile environment for manipulation. People were told that failing to tithe faithfully could open them to demonic attack. They were encouraged to sow special seeds into the ministry, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars, to receive prophetic breakthroughs. And then came the unthinkable demands. Members were instructed to hand over tax returns for assessment, turn over inheritance, money for kingdom use, and submit receipts, so leadership could determine whether they were spending money in alignment with God's plan. Desperate congregants complied. One member later revealed that she gave up her entire life savings after being told that withholding it would curse her future generations. Another reported that Eckhardt pressured him to leave his career and work full-time for the church, unpaid, while the pastor's personal wealth continued to grow. Shock came when former members began describing what happened behind closed doors, the spiritual intimidation, the fear-based teachings, and the emotional breakdowns many experienced during marathon deliverance rituals. Some described being shouted at for hours while being told demons were speaking through them. Others recounted being isolated, cut off from family members considered spiritually dangerous. Couples were advised to separate if one spouse didn't fully submit to the ministry. These were not merely theological disagreements. These were patterns of psychological coercion. Some testimonies from women in the church were even more disturbing. Though not all involved physical abuse, many involved extreme spiritual manipulation. Women were told their obedience to pastoral leadership would determine their spiritual worth. Single women were encouraged to remain in spiritual submission rather than dating or pursuing relationships outside Eckhart's approval. One former member said she was pressured to confess non-existent sexual sins as part of a purification ritual. There were no formal charges of sexual misconduct against Eckhardt personally, but the environment he created blurred lines so deeply that boundaries no longer existed. Everything, finances, relationships, careers, personal decisions, fell under church control. Tension rose as the story spread beyond Chicago. Former members posted testimonies online. Survivors began documenting the psychological harm they experienced. Mental health professionals who later treated ex-members reported patterns consistent with trauma bonds, religious abuse syndrome, and coercive control. Eckhardt and his supporters denied wrongdoing, calling these ex-members bitter, rebellious, or spiritually immature. Accusations were dismissed as attacks from the enemy, but the volume of complaints grew too large to ignore. Families who lost children to the ministry's influence began organizing support groups. Some compared the church's internal structure to a hypershare sect. A turning point came when financial investigators began reviewing the church's operations following public complaints of improper stewardship. While no criminal charges were filed, the scrutiny exposed concerning discrepancies in accounting, unexplained ministry expenses, and substantial amounts of donor money funneled into personal projects. Media attention intensified. Local reporters interviewed dozens of former members, who described the emotional toll of their time under Eckhardt's leadership. Many said they suffered breakdowns, panic attacks, or years of confusion after leaving. Several said they had to relearn the basic idea of decision-making after being conditioned to believe that questioning leadership was sinful. Under pressure, leadership made public statements acknowledging mistakes in judgment, but stopped short of admitting wrongdoing. Some reforms were promised, but insiders reported that little actually changed. Aftermath for victims was long and painful. Some spent years rebuilding relationships with family members they had cut off. Others struggled financially after giving up careers or large sums of money. Many required counseling to address fear, conditioning, shame, or trauma. Eckhardt himself continued preaching, but his reputation was permanently fractured. While he still had supporters, he was no longer seen as an unquestioned authority. His ministry's influence shrank dramatically as more former members shared their stories. His books remained in circulation, but their message was overshadowed by the harm inflicted by the man who wrote them. Reflection lingers because this story reveals a form of predation not always recognized. Not every predator uses violence. Some use scripture, some use prophecy, some use fear of the unseen. And when the predator is someone the community trusts, someone with charisma, confidence, and spiritual vocabulary, the damage can take years to uncover. The haunting question left behind is simple. How many lives can be controlled, reshaped, or broken in the name of spiritual authority before people finally see the harm as clearly as the faith that hides it? Pastor Kenneth Adkins, known for his fiery sermons, hardline moral positions, and relentless attacks against the LGBTQ community, he presented himself as a warrior for righteousness. To many, he was the voice of uncompromising Christian conservatism. But behind the pulpit, behind the carefully crafted persona, lay one of the darkest double lives in modern pastoral scandal. Curiosity first surrounded Adkins because he wasn't a typical pastor. Most preachers rise quietly through seminary or lifelong church involvement. Adkins arrived like a storm. He had a background in politics, marketing, and public relations before becoming a pastor, and he wielded those skills aggressively. In Florida and Georgia, he built his reputation on controversy. He attacked political opponents from the pulpit. He publicly shamed people he disagreed with. He crafted himself into a religious provocateur, someone who thrived on confrontation. His church wasn't merely a sanctuary, it was a stage. Members described him as charismatic but intimidating. He spoke with absolute certainty. He claimed he could discern spirits, detect liars, and spot hidden sin. For some, this made him a powerful figure of spiritual authority. For others, it made him frightening. His rise coincided with the cultural debates surrounding same-sex marriage and transgender rights. Adkins positioned himself at the center of these battles. With incendiary rhetoric, his social media posts turned heads. He released public statements filled with condemnation. He attacked LGBTQ youth with what he claimed was righteous truth, and he styled himself as a modern prophet, standing against moral decay. All the while, he gathered followers who saw him as a fearless defender of faith. And it was precisely this moral grandstanding, this loud, aggressive, militant preaching, that made the eventual revelations so devastating. Shock entered the story in August 2016, when news broke that Adkins had been arrested for the sexual abuse of a minor. Not just any minor, a boy and girl who had both been part of his ministry. The accusations were horrifying. Investigators revealed that Adkins had engaged in sexual acts with the then minor boy and girl in church-related settings, during times when he was supposed to be providing mentorship and spiritual guidance. The case unfolded like a nightmare for members of his congregation. People who once defended him could barely speak. The accusations included acts that were not impulsive, but deliberate, calculated, and repeated. The most disturbing details came from the victims' testimonies, how Adkins manipulated them under the guise of leadership, how he abused trust, and how he used spiritual authority as cover for exploitation. Prosecutors described the pastor as a predator who groomed vulnerable teens by positioning himself as the center of their world, the guide, the father figure, the spiritual mentor, and then slowly crossing boundaries until the teens were trapped in silence and shame. The shock grew deeper when investigators discovered that Adkins had been grooming the victims for years, not weeks, not months, years, all while preaching against the very sins he secretly committed. Tension skyrocketed as the investigation expanded. Adkins denied everything. He claimed he was the victim of a political conspiracy, that he was being targeted because of his outspoken positions. He insisted the teens were lying. He accused law enforcement of bias. He framed the entire ordeal as an attack on Christianity itself. But the evidence grew stronger. Messages, testimonies, behavioral patterns. Witnesses from his church began coming forward, not with direct abuse allegations, but with stories of his controlling behavior, his obsession with appearances, his fixation on the private lives of congregants. Some recalled how he frequently surrounded himself with teens and young adults, especially those from troubled backgrounds. It gave him the appearance of being a compassionate mentor. It also gave him access to the most vulnerable. The trial became a public spectacle. Adkins' defense team attempted to poke holes in the victims' stories. They tried to cast doubt, evoke confusion, distort timelines, but prosecutors laid out a timeline that showed intentional grooming, calculated exploitation, and long-term manipulation. The courtroom atmosphere was tense, filled with former supporters who came to see whether the man they had idolized was truly capable of the crimes described. One witness described the pastor as a master manipulator, who hid his predatory behavior behind a wall of spiritual authority. Another said that Adkins kept the teens so emotionally dependent on him that they felt trapped. The jury listened as the victims, now older, spoke through trembling voices, recounting how the man who performed baptisms and preached purity violated their innocence. The verdict came swiftly, guilty on multiple counts of child molestation. The judge sentenced Adkins to 35 years in prison, effectively a life sentence for a man his age. As the sentence was read, the courtroom felt split between disbelief and resignation. Some of his die-hard supporters wept. Others sat stone-faced, unable to reconcile the charismatic preacher with the predator described in court. Aftermath for the victims was complicated. Some found validation in the conviction. Others struggled with guilt, confusion, and the immense psychological scars that come from being abused by a religious authority figure. Many expressed a mixture of relief and devastation. Relief that he could no longer hurt others. Devastation that someone they trusted with their souls used that trust to commit acts of profound harm. For the congregations he once led, the fallout was severe. Attendance plummeted. Ministries collapsed. Families split between those who accepted the truth and those who insisted it was a setup. Scandals involving pastors always cause spiritual whiplash, but this one struck especially hard because Adkins had made morality his brand. People who once defended him were left questioning how they could have been so blind. Adkins' political allies scrambled to distance themselves. Public figures who once shared his platform deleted photos, erased statements, and claimed they never truly knew him. But videos and articles from years prior showed a different story. He had been embraced, praised, and elevated by many who agreed with his harsh ideological stances. Prison changed nothing about Adkins' public posture. Even behind bars, he maintained his innocence. He claimed he was persecuted for his beliefs, not punished for his actions. He wrote letters, insisting that he was a martyr, but few were listening. Society had moved on. His legacy was permanently stained by the crimes he committed. Reflection lingers painfully in this case because it exposes a truth more disturbing than the crime itself. People often assume that those who shout the loudest about morality are the most moral, that those who preach purity must be pure, that those who condemn others with righteous anger must be safe themselves. But sometimes, those very qualities, the loudness, the moral absolutism, the self-declared spiritual authority, are masks worn by predators seeking cover. The haunting question left behind is this: how many pastors weaponize morality, not to protect their congregations, but to shield their own secrets? Gerald "Jerry" Harris. He was known as a charismatic pastor, worship leader, and a rising figure in one of the most influential conservative Christian organizations in the United States. For many years, he was the public face of family values, holiness, and moral leadership. He toured churches, spoke at youth conferences, and built a reputation as a vibrant communicator who could connect with teens and adults alike. Curiosity first surrounded Harris because he seemed so normal, almost unremarkably wholesome. He had an everyman appearance, friendly, approachable, always smiling in photos with youth groups and volunteers. Born and raised in a religious environment, he grew into a role that many believed he was destined for. He didn't have the firebrand persona of some pastors or the domineering style of authoritarian leaders. Instead, he radiated the kind of gentle warmth that put parents at ease. He worked as a pastor, but his influence expanded far beyond a single congregation. He served at a church that was part of a massive religious network, one that broadcasted sermons, published curriculum, and reached families nationwide. Harris became a recognizable figure in that community. Parents trusted him. Teens admired him. Too many. He represented a safe, reliable Christian mentor. He appeared to live a clean life, devoted to his wife, his ministry, and his calling. He helped lead worship. He organized youth events. He traveled to conferences. Everything about him suggested sincerity and earnest dedication. People who worked alongside him described him as soft-spoken, kind, and supportive. But behind the gentle persona was a dramatically different reality. Shock rippled through the evangelical world in September 2020, when federal agents arrested Harris on charges related to child sexual exploitation. The details were horrifying. Investigators had discovered that Harris was using messaging apps and social media platforms to contact minors, some as young as 13, sending sexual messages, soliciting explicit content, and engaging in conversations that revealed a hidden life completely at odds with his public image. The shock deepened when the court documents revealed the extent of his predatory behavior. Harris had not merely made a mistake, he had engaged in intentional, repeated exploitation of minors. In several cases, he coerced victims by posing as a minor himself, manipulating them into sending explicit images. In others, he simply used his position of authority to gain access to young people who trusted him. But perhaps the most devastating detail, the one that crushed the congregation's sense of safety, was that some of the messages were sent from a church-owned device, a device intended for ministry, a device entrusted to him because he was believed to be a man of integrity. When investigators raided the home, they seized electronics containing vast amounts of illegal material. The charges mounted quickly: counts of sexual exploitation, possession of child pornography, enticement of minors. Harris was denying nothing. The evidence was too overwhelming. Tension rose dramatically as the public began asking questions, not just about Harris' personal actions, but about the church structures surrounding him. How long had this been happening? Who knew? Had there been warnings? Had anyone silenced concerns? The truth was uncomfortable. Several red flags had appeared before the arrest. Small things, seemingly benign at the time. Overly personal conversations with teens, late-night messaging, unusual requests for privacy. Yet none of these scattered concerns seemed significant enough for anyone to imagine the truth. Parents were devastated. Volunteers were shaken. The larger organization, which had built much of its brand around family values and moral purity, issued public statements expressing horror and distancing themselves from Harris. Church leaders conducted internal reviews. Lawyers became involved. Crisis counselors were brought in to help the congregation process the betrayal, but the community was divided. Some members could not reconcile the gentle pastor they knew with the predator described in court documents. Others felt something had always been off, even if they couldn't articulate it. The tension peaked during the courtroom proceedings. Prosecutors described Harris as a carefully calculating predator who used his access to victims through ministry and online platforms. They presented evidence showing that he deliberately targeted vulnerable teens, those struggling with self-esteem, loneliness, or confusion. He used flattery, empathy, and false promises to manipulate them. The victims' statements were devastating. Some spoke of shattered trust. Others described the shame and fear they felt when asked to send images they didn't understand. One victim wrote that Harris took away the safest part of my life, my faith community. Harris himself appeared remorseful in court. In a trembling voice, he apologized, acknowledging his crimes and the profound damage he caused. But no apology could undo the trauma inflicted on the children or the spiritual devastation suffered by the congregation. The sentence was severe. A federal judge sentenced Harris to 12 years and 7 months in prison, followed by supervised release and mandatory registration as a sex offender. The judge called his actions profoundly destructive, noting that Harris had violated the deepest trust society places in spiritual leaders. Aftermath for the victims continues to unfold. Some are still in therapy, working through the confusion of being abused by someone who claimed to represent God. Several families withdrew from church communities entirely, unable to reconcile their faith with the betrayal they experienced. Others sought different congregations, quieter, smaller, more cautious. A few found themselves questioning religion altogether. For the church where Harris served, rebuilding has been slow and painful. Leaders faced immense scrutiny. Policies were rewritten. Background checks intensified. Volunteers underwent new training. Transparency became a priority, driven by the desperate need to restore trust. But the spiritual damage, the feeling of safety being ripped away, still lingers. Harris is currently serving his sentence in federal prison. His public persona is gone. His career is over. The legacy he once hoped to build has been replaced with a criminal record and a trail of broken lives. Reflection hangs grimly over this case. Harris wasn't a loud extremist. He wasn't a confrontational preacher. He wasn't a hardline culture warrior. He was soft-spoken, gentle, and friendly, the kind of pastor parents felt safe handing their children over to. And that makes the story even more unsettling. Predators do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like mentors. Sometimes they look like family friends. Sometimes they look like pastors leading worship with a smile. The haunting question left behind is one that chills every parent, every volunteer, and every congregation. How do you protect the innocent when the danger is hiding behind the mask of the trusted? By the mid-1990s, Bishop Carleton Pearson was one of the most recognizable faces in American Pentecostal. His voice carried across millions of television screens every Sunday. His megachurch in Tulsa overflowed with worshippers. His annual Azusa Conference attracted some of the biggest names in evangelical Christianity. He was charismatic, well-spoken, handsome, and appeared, at least from the outside, to be a man chosen for greatness. But behind the polished smile and the commanding sermons was a man living two lives. And for years, his congregation would not know the truth. This isn't just the story of a preacher who fell from grace. Cliff's the story of a spiritual empire built on loyalty, fear, and manipulation. It's the story of how hundreds of people trusted a man who claimed to hear from God, only to discover he was hiding secrets that would shatter an entire religious community. Tonight, we look at the slow unraveling of a ministry that once stood atop the world, and ended in estrangement, scandal, and a trail of wounded followers who still live with the consequences. Carleton Pearson was raised in San Diego, one of 6 children in a deeply religious family. His father, a black Pentecostal preacher, instilled strict discipline and spiritual intensity. As a child, Pearson seemed destined to follow in those footsteps. He studied theology at Oral Roberts University, and his talent caught the attention of Oral Roberts himself, who became his mentor. By age 30, Pearson was preaching at national conferences. By 35, he founded Higher Dimensions Evangelistic Center, a church that grew from a small gathering in a rented storefront into a 6,000-member. But as the congregation grew, so did Pearson's world. He lived in a multi-million-dollar home. He traveled constantly. He met celebrities, politicians, and business leaders. He shook hands with presidents. He built a brand so powerful that supporters donated vast amounts of money just to keep the ministry expanding. Inside the church, many followers believed he had a supernatural gift and ability to sense when someone needed help, an uncanny charisma that convinced them he was a prophet. But there was another side. Former staff members later described his growing vanity, control issues, and the pressure to obey him without question. He could explode in anger behind closed doors, then step onto the stage minutes later with a serene, forgiving smile. His ministries handled millions of dollars per year, and Pearson maintained almost total control over finances. Former members recalled being encouraged, sometimes pressured to tithe, even when they couldn't afford it. According to multiple accounts, Pearson increasingly used the church's money to support a lavish lifestyle while leaving the ministry perpetually in debt. And beneath the financial issues and the ego, something else was brewing, something he kept hidden from everyone. The scandal that eventually destroyed Pearson's ministry didn't begin with the crime itself. It began with doctrine. In the early 2000s, Pearson announced a controversial belief known as the gospel of inclusion, the idea that God saves everyone, regardless of belief in Jesus. He preached that hell didn't exist, that judgment was unnecessary, and that salvation was universal. This theological shift shocked the evangelical world. Pastors distanced themselves. Longtime supporters withdrew funding. The Azusa Conference collapsed. Higher Dimensions Church lost nearly 2/3 of its members in just 1 year. But while many people believed Pearson's downfall was purely doctrinal, the truth was more complicated. Behind the scenes, former members and staff had begun raising concerns about financial mismanagement, unauthorized use of ministry funds for personal expenses, pressure on congregants for excessive giving, nepotism and favoritism within leadership, emotional manipulation disguised as spiritual direction. According to interviews with former employees, Pearson routinely approved personal expenditures, expensive trips, upscale hotels, designer clothing using church accounts. These were not accidental bookkeeping errors. They were patterns. One staff member described, everything had to serve the ministry, but the ministry had to serve him. Another recalled being told to create a justification on paperwork, so purchases appeared mid. There were no criminal charges filed, but that was largely due to the way non-profit laws and church structures protect religious leaders. Internally, however, the damage was clear. Creditors began calling, bills went unpaid. The once gigantic ministry was sinking. When congregants asked where their donations were going, they were told to trust the bishop. Many didn't till it was too late. There was no formal criminal investigation by police or federal authorities, but the internal investigations conducted by church leadership and associated ministries painted a troubling picture. After Pearson embraced the gospel of inclusion, many of the elders resigned. Some asked to see the financial records. Others attempted to confront him over questionable spending. According to their accounts, the bishop resisted transparency. This triggered an informal inquiry by the Joint College of African American Pentecostal Bishops. While their focus was doctrinal, they also reviewed the administrative practices of higher dimensions. Multiple leaders reported lack of financial oversight, missing documentation for large expenditures, a pattern of using ministry funds for personal travel, donor money spent on the bishop's private lifestyle, a leadership environment where questioning Pearson was rebellion. One former board member said, "We were told that disagreeing with him meant disagreeing with God. What had once been framed as divine authority now appeared as coercive control." The final report from the Joint College declared Pearson's theology heretical, but insiders knew financial concerns played a major role in their decision to strip him of recognition. Congregants later attempted their own independent review, piecing together information from former staff. What emerged was a portrait of a preacher whose ministry finances were entangled with his personal life to an unhealthy and potentially unlawful degree. Again, no criminal charges were filed, but many members felt spiritually defrauded. They had poured money into a ministry believing it was building God's kingdom, not sustaining a lifestyle. While no legal trial took place, the court of public opinion handed down its verdict swiftly and harshly. The evangelical world rejected Pearson. The megachurch emptied. Ministry leaders cut ties. TV networks stopped broadcasting his sermons. Speaking invitations dried up. Major Christian publishers withdrew support. The man once hailed as the future of Pentecostalism became a theological outcast. Financially, the collapse was brutal. Higher Dimensions Church lost its building. The ministry downsized from thousands of members to fewer than 200. Donors vanished almost overnight. In interviews, Pearson insisted he did nothing wrong, that he never misused funds, never manipulated anyone, never intended to deceive. He claimed the real crime was the church turning against him for preaching compassion. But the congregation remembered things differently. "He abandoned us," one former member said, "not because of doctrine, because he forgot what ministry was supposed to be." Years later, Pearson shifted into a new career, writing and speaking in progressive spiritual circles. But within the evangelical community, his legacy was fractured. Some saw him as a tragic figure. Others called him a false prophet. Many still believe they were financially exploited. What remains undisputed is that the ministry he built from nothing died in a slow, painful collapse, leaving thousands of people confused, angry, and betrayed. After the fall of higher dimensions, Pearson moved into a small role at All Souls Unitarian Church, later joining their staff as an associate pastor. Former congregants were stunned. The man who once preached fiery Pentecostal doctrines now stood behind a different pulpit with a different message. Financially, he struggled for years. Socially, he lost friends and connections. Spiritually, he remained defiant. But the real aftermath lived within the people he left behind. Some members lost trust in churches altogether. Others faced financial ruin after giving beyond their means. Families split over whether to remain loyal to the bishop. Children who grew up in the megachurch later described feeling like they had been part of a cult. Pearson's ministry had shaped thousands of lives. Its collapse shattered many of them. When the Netflix film Come Sunday dramatized his story, some viewers sympathized, seeing him as a misunderstood visionary. But former members saw something different, a man whose personal crises, doctrinal shifts, and lack of accountability caused immeasurable harm. Carleton Pearson passed away in 2023, yet the unanswered questions surrounding his ministry remain. For decades, Pearson's followers believed they were supporting God's work. But when the truth surfaced, many realized they had supported a man, not a mission. This case forces us to ask, how much authority should any preacher have? And how do we protect ourselves when charisma replaces accountability? When trust is placed in the wrong hands, even a man who once preached salvation can leave behind a legacy of spiritual and financial devastation. Dean Faiello was never ordained. He was never licensed. He never attended seminary. He never led a church from a pulpit in the traditional sense. And yet, strangely, disturbingly, he learned to sound like a preacher. He learned to speak in the tone of a man of God. He learned to speak with the calm, soothing authority of someone who seemed to possess divine knowledge. And that vocal style, that confident, spiritual cadence, would help him deceive people for nearly a decade. His clients trusted him because of that voice. They trusted him because he carried himself like a healer, like a man with higher purpose. He built an image around himself that looked almost pastoral, compassionate, wise, reassuring, always ready with a soft-spoken promise that everything would be okay. He prayed with clients. He spoke about God guiding his hands. He used the language of faith to quiet their doubts, and, by the time anyone realized the truth, it was far too late. Faiello's story isn't about a typical preacher. It's about a man who weaponized spiritual trust without ever stepping inside a seminary. He pretended to be a doctor, a healer, a specialist, prose people instinctively view as sacred. He took that trust and used it to commit one of the most shocking hidden crimes New York City has ever seen. The story begins in the 1990s, when Dean Faiello was living in Manhattan and introducing himself as a skincare specialist. He told clients he was trained, licensed, gifted. Many described him as gentle, charismatic, and strangely comforting. He referred to himself as spiritually intuitive. He prayed before procedures. He cited God's protection as the reason his treatments were safe. He marketed himself as guided by faith and healing. It was all a lie. He had no medical license. He had no qualifications, and he had no right to perform any medical procedure whatsoever. But the way he spoke softly, confidently, with a preacher-like tone drew people to him. His clients came from all walks of life: teachers, business people, models, young professionals. Many said later that he felt like someone you could trust immediately. That's how a predator works. That's how someone who understands the psychology of faith preys on people who want to believe in goodness. What Faiello offered were cosmetic procedures, laser treatments, skin rejuvenation, mole removals. Small things at first, safe things, things that didn't seem dangerous. But as his confidence grew, so did the risks he was willing to take. He rented office spaces. He bought equipment he had no legal right to use. He stocked medical tools he barely understood. He performed procedures that should only be done by licensed physicians. The law caught up to him multiple times. He was arrested more than once for practicing medicine without a license. He was fined. He was warned. He was confronted. And every time, he returned to his clients and reassured them, just as a manipulative preacher would reassure a frightened congregation, that God had him protected, that the law was mistaken, that he was being targeted unfairly. It worked. People believed him. And that belief cost someone their life. In 2001, a young woman named Maria Cruz became one of Faiello's regular clients. She was intelligent, professional, and successful. She worked in the financial sector and was known for her discipline and her kindness. She also struggled with a skin condition that made her so. Cruz, like many people seeking cosmetic help, was vulnerable but not unintelligent. She checked his background. She confronted him about the rumors that he wasn't licensed. According to friends and family, she asked him directly if he was legally allowed to perform treatments. And this is where Faiello's manipulative, preacher-like charm reached its deadliest point. He told her that God had called him to healing. He told her that paperwork was just bureaucracy. He told her he had been persecuted unfairly. He told her that his gift came from a higher authority. And he looked her in the eyes with that same soothing voice, the voice that made countless people feel like they were in the presence of a man who cared about them. When Maria Cruz scheduled an appointment with him on January 13, 2003, she believed she was walking into a room with someone guided by faith and skill. She was walking into a trap. During the session, Faiello administered a local anesthetic he was not trained to use. The dosage was wrong. The way he delivered it was wrong. He did not have the skill, the equipment, or the emergency training to handle complications. Maria Cruz began to convulse. She stopped breathing. In any licensed medical office, this would have triggered emergency protocols. A real doctor would have administered oxygen, called paramedics, used resuscitation equipment. They would have had the training to respond within seconds. But Faiello froze, then panicked, then made the decision that would seal his fate forever. He didn't call the police. He didn't call an ambulance. He didn't seek help. Instead, he let Maria Cruz die on the table, and then he hid her body. The next hours remained some of the darkest in New York's medical crime history. Faiello wrapped her body. He panicked, pacing between fear and delusion. He later said he prayed over her. He said he begged God for forgiveness. He said he hoped she would wake up, but she didn't, and he knew she wouldn't. What he did next was not desperation, it was calculation. He placed her body inside a large suitcase. He rented a storage space behind a house in Newark, New Jersey. He dug a shallow grave beneath the garage floor, placed the suitcase inside, and poured concrete over it. A false healer, a fake doctor, a man who spoke like a preacher burying a woman under a garage floor to hide his crime. Maria Cruz's family was devastated when she vanished. She was not the type of person to disappear. She lived a stable life. She was close to her family. She was punctual, responsible, and not involved in anything that could draw danger to her. Her co-workers noticed her absence. Her church noticed her absence. Her family filed a missing person report almost immediately. Investigators searched for leads, and Faiello's name came up quickly, but he insisted she never arrived for her appointment. He told investigators he prayed for her safety. He acted concerned, and then he fled the country. Before authorities could bring charges, Faiello boarded a plane to Costa Rica. He settled there under an alias. He lived comfortably, even romantically, with a new partner who had no idea what he had done. For 2 years, he lived like nothing had happened, enjoying beaches, restaurants, and sunshine while the family of Maria Cruz mourned. Meanwhile, investigators worked relentlessly. They traced his financial records, his phone calls, his prior arrests. They confronted former clients, many of whom felt ashamed for trusting him. His flight only made him appear guiltier, and eventually, cracks began to form in the life he built in Costa Rica. Someone recognized him, someone remembered his story, and authorities arrested him on the beach. Even then, even as he was dragged into custody, he insisted he was a healer, not a killer. He claimed it was an accident, that he had prayed for forgiveness, that he meant no harm. This is the insidious part of his story. Predators who hide behind spiritual language rarely see themselves as criminals. They see themselves as misunderstood, chosen, gifted. They use the language of God to justify the harm they cause. When Faiello was extradited back to the United States, investigators confronted him with the truth. They found Maria Cruz's body exactly where he left, at under concrete, sealed inside a suitcase. The sight was horrific. The reality was undeniable. He did not confess out of guilt. He confessed because there was no other option. In 2006, facing overwhelming evidence, Dean Faiello pleaded guilty to first-degree assault. The charge prosecutors used strategically because proving intentional murder would have been a longer and far more difficult battle. Even so, he admitted in court that his illegal actions directly caused Maria Cruz's death. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. For Maria Cruz's family, the pain never faded. They had trusted a man who spoke like a pastor, who offered the comfort of spirituality, who used God's name as a protective shield for his deception. They lost a daughter, a sister, a friend because someone they believed was safe was actually a predator in disguise. Faiello served his time in New York. By the time he was released, he had become a cautionary tale taught in medical ethics courses, criminal justice lectures, and psychological studies of con artists. His case became a symbol of how charisma wrapped in spiritual language can disarm even the most intelligent, careful people. And that's ultimately what makes this story so chilling. Dean Faiello didn't run a church, but he behaved exactly like the preachers who prey on their congregations. He used the same tactics: authority, confidence, spiritual rhetoric, soothing promises, and emotional manipulation. He knew how to sound like a man who cared about your soul, even as he endangered your body. He preyed on vulnerability. He preyed on trust. He preyed on faith in goodness. The question that lingers long after his case is closed is the same question that haunts all stories in this documentary. How can you protect yourself from someone who speaks like a savior but hides the heart of a predator? Michael Scrivner was a man who seemed, on the surface, to have everything a pastor could desire: charisma, wealth, influence, and a congregation that revered him as a spiritual authority. Leading a medium-sized church in suburban Pennsylvania, Scrivner cultivated a persona that combined financial savvy with religious zeal. He claimed he was a servant of God, a shepherd of souls, and a moral compass for families seeking guidance in a chaotic world. He preached about honesty, faith, and righteous living. Yet behind the closed doors of his office, and in the shadows of his own ambitions, Scrivner engaged in practices that would shock his congregation, his colleagues, and the law. It began quietly. Scrivner had a keen understanding of how to appeal to both spiritual and financial instincts. He encouraged generous giving, often framing it as a divine obligation. "God blesses those who give," he would say in sermons that carried the weight of spiritual authority. To withhold is to invite misfortune upon yourself and your family. Congregants, many of whom were already in vulnerable financial positions, felt pressured to comply. They didn't see his demands as coercion. They saw them as guidance from a man of God. That trust, that belief in divine authority, became Scrivner's weapon. Over time, investigators would later describe Scrivner's financial activities as a sophisticated fraud scheme. He used donations, ostensibly for church projects and charitable initiatives, to finance personal ventures and lavish spending. He invested in real estate, luxury vehicles, and high-end vacations, all under the guise of expanding the church's influence. He presented spreadsheets and progress reports during church meetings, giving the impression of transparency and good stewardship. Members nodded and trusted him, never suspecting that their contributions were being diverted for personal gain. The audacity of his deception relied on his status as a spiritual leader and the power of his sermons. The shock came when federal authorities began receiving complaints from congregants who had started noticing inconsistencies. Some had been promised specific uses of their tithes repairs to the church, aid for local families, funding for youth programs, but those projects were never completed. Others saw financial statements that appeared doctored or misrepresented. What followed was an investigation that peeled back layers of deception. Authorities discovered that Scrivner had misappropriated hundreds of thousands of dollars. They found falsified records, accounts under pseudonyms, and evidence that some church funds were being funneled into offshore accounts. His careful orchestration of spreadsheets and reports had created the illusion of legitimacy, allowing him to maintain his public image even as he stole from those who trusted him most. The tension escalated as news of the investigation leaked. Congregants were divided. Some refused to believe the allegations, convinced that their pastor could do no wrong. Others were horrified, feeling betrayed and manipulated. Families who had given generously experienced a profound sense of violation, not just financial but spiritual. They had been led to believe that they were fulfilling God's will, only to discover they were being deceived. The trial was a public spectacle. Scrivner's defense tried to frame the issue as misunderstanding or clerical error. He argued that he had intended to use the funds appropriately and that any misallocation was accidental. Prosecutors presented evidence showing intentional mismanagement, fraudulent transfers, and deliberate concealment of assets. They highlighted the ways in which he leveraged his position as a pastor to persuade congregants to part with their money. Witnesses described the emotional manipulation he employed. Members recalled sermons that subtly shamed those who questioned giving, encouraging compliance through fear of divine disfavor. Former employees testified that they were instructed to create financial documents that obscured the true flow of money. One described it as an invisible line between what was right and what he wanted, and we were told to step over it for God. The courtroom atmosphere was tense. Congregants sat in the back rows, some in disbelief, some in silent anger. Families who had once revered Scrivner watched as the truth emerged piece by piece. Evidence of lavish spending was laid bare. Luxury cars, expensive vacations, and even private club memberships purchased using funds meant for the church's charitable work. Prosecutors underscored that the harm was not only financial, but deeply personal. Each donation represented trust, faith, and hope. Scrivner was convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and embezzlement. The judge sentenced him to 7 years in federal prison, accompanied by restitution payments to victims. In court, Scrivner maintained his innocence, claiming that God had guided his decisions and that he had no intention of harming anyone. His calm, preacher-like demeanor remained, but it no longer commanded trust. It now felt hollow, almost sinister. The aftermath was devastating. Congregants who had poured their savings into church programs faced financial hardship. Many families left the church, disillusioned by the betrayal. Local charities that had relied on donations from Scrivner's congregation found themselves underfunded, and the spiritual wounds were deep. Members struggled with the realization that the very man who had claimed to guide their moral lives had exploited them for personal gain. For Scrivner, prison was a quiet sentence. Removed from the pulpit and the adoring congregation, he lost not only his freedom, but the influence that had once elevated him to near celebrity status in his community. Reports from fellow inmates suggested that he retained his charisma, speaking to others with the same preacher-like authority that had fooled thousands. Yet outside, his empire had crumbled, and his name had become synonymous with betrayal. Reflection on this case underscores a chilling reality. Financial deception by spiritual leaders can cause harm that extends far beyond money. It destroys faith, ruptures communities, and leaves victims questioning their judgment, their beliefs, and even their relationship with God. Michael Scrivner's crimes were not violent in the traditional sense, but they preyed on trust, hope, and faith, the very foundations of human vulnerability. The haunting question left by Scrivner's story is stark. How can communities distinguish between genuine spiritual guidance and a facade built on manipulation and greed? How do you trust someone whose words sound like salvation, but whose actions lead only to ruin? Wayne Bryant's name was once synonymous with community trust. In a small town in Georgia, he led a modest but respected congregation. His church wasn't a megachurch, nor did it have national reach, but Bryant wielded a unique influence over the families he shepherded. People trusted him because he lived among them, dined with them, and preached from the same pulpit week after week. To them, he was a pillar of the community, a man who could offer guidance on spiritual, personal, and even financial matters. Bryant's rise to influence seemed natural. Born and raised in the South, he learned from an early age the value of faith as both comfort and authority. He cultivated a warm, approachable personality that made people feel safe. He understood human psychology, and he had a talent for sensing vulnerabilities. Congregants would confide in him, sharing their fears, dreams, and financial anxieties. He listened attentively, nodding, offering advice that felt grounded in both scripture and common sense. It was this combination of spiritual authority and personal trust that allowed Bryant to weave an intricate web of deception. He claimed to be investing church funds into opportunities that would benefit everyone: real estate projects, charitable programs, and local businesses. Members of the congregation, many of whom had modest incomes, were encouraged to invest their savings alongside the church. Bryant presented the investments as safe, divinely guided, and a way to multiply God's blessings. At first, the results seemed promising. Small returns were paid out, enough to validate his claims and encourage deeper investments. People felt blessed. They believed they were participating in a plan orchestrated by God, a plan that would benefit both the church and themselves. The trust they placed in Bryant was total. After all, he had never steered them wrong before. But behind the veneer of prosperity, Bryant's actions were anything but benign. Investigators later discovered that he had been misappropriating the funds for personal use, funding a lifestyle far beyond what his modest salary would have allowed. Lavish vacations, luxury cars, and personal home renovations were all paid for with money meant to advance church programs or support congregants' investments. He created fake documents and falsified financial statements to maintain the illusion of legitimacy. The tension began to mount when several members requested audits or asked for clarification on the promised returns. Bryant responded with reassurance, invoking God's guidance as proof that their faith would yield results. He discouraged questioning, framing any doubt as a test of spiritual obedience. "Trust in God's plan," he would say, "and all will be well. Do not let fear cloud your faith." For a time, this tactic worked. People silenced their suspicions, comforted by the preacher's charisma and apparent sincerity. But the cracks in Bryant's scheme were widening. Delayed payments, inconsistent reports, and third-party complaints began to accumulate. Some investors noticed their funds were not being properly accounted for, while others realized that promised returns were not materializing. Eventually, the pattern of deception caught the attention of state regulators. Investigators uncovered a complex network of accounts, shell corporations, and falsified records designed to obscure the true flow of money. It became evident that Bryant had been running a sophisticated fraud scheme, using his pastoral position to exploit the very people who trusted him most. Shock rippled through the community as details emerged. Members felt betrayed, humiliated, and enraged. Families who had invested life savings discovered that their money was gone. The church's credibility collapsed overnight. Local media coverage painted Bryant as a man who had weaponized faith for personal enrichment. Former friends and allies who once vouched for his character began distancing themselves, shocked by the scale and audacity of his crimes. During the trial, prosecutors presented extensive evidence of Bryant's deliberate deception. Emails, bank records, and testimonies illustrated a pattern of premeditation. Witnesses described how he used spiritual language to manipulate emotions, create urgency, and suppress doubt. One former congregant recounted, "He didn't just ask for our money, he made us believe that God himself wanted us to give. It was like being commanded to obey by divine authority." The courtroom was tense and emotionally charged. Families sat in silence, listening as their trust and faith were dissected. As the full extent of Bryant's actions became undeniable, prosecutors emphasized the human cost of his crimes: shattered savings, broken families, and a fractured sense of spiritual security. Bryant attempted to defend himself by claiming good intentions. He said he had made mistakes, but that his actions were never meant to harm anyone. He argued that he had believed in the investments and trusted that God would make them profitable. But the evidence was overwhelming. Intentional misrepresentation, falsification of documents, and personal enrichment at the expense of his flock left little room for doubt. Ultimately, Wayne Bryant was convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and embezzlement. He received a sentence of 10 years in federal prison, along with orders to repay a substantial portion of the funds to his victims. While restitution provided some financial relief, the emotional and spiritual damage inflicted on the congregation endured far longer. The aftermath of Bryant's actions reverberated through the community. Families struggled to rebuild financially, many losing retirement savings, college funds, and emergency reserves. Trust in religious leadership was severely shaken. Some congregants abandoned organized religion entirely, unable to reconcile faith with betrayal. Others sought solace in smaller, less hierarchical communities, where accountability and transparency were prioritized. Bryant himself lost everything. His reputation was permanently destroyed, his ministry dismantled, and his personal relationships severed. In prison, he reportedly retained the same persuasive manner and preacher-like tone, but it no longer commanded trust. It became a chilling reminder of the damage his charisma had wrought. Reflection on Wayne Bryant's case raises difficult questions about faith, trust, and authority. Preachers often hold immense influence over their congregants, and in communities where questioning spiritual leaders is discouraged, the potential for abuse increases exponentially. Bryant's crimes demonstrate how spiritual authority can be weaponized to manipulate, deceive, and exploit, leaving long-lasting scars that extend far beyond financial loss. The haunting question left behind is stark. How can individuals discern between genuine spiritual guidance and manipulation when trust is intertwined with faith? How do communities protect themselves when the line between pastoral care and predation is blurred by charisma, authority, and the promise of divine blessing? Bryant's story is a cautionary tale for anyone who places blind faith in spiritual leaders. No matter how comforting or persuasive their words may seem, the lessons extend beyond one church, one town, or one pastor. They are a warning about the fragile boundary between trust and exploitation, a boundary that once crossed can leave a lifetime of consequences in its wake. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive.